A hand grabbed a woman by the hair and shoved her face first into the mud. She hit the ground hard. A man stood over her, laughing, and the rain came down in sheets around them. He kicked her once in the ribs, then again. She didn't fight back. She couldn't. Whiskey had taken her legs out from under her hours ago. The man reached down for her purse. And that's when a truck door slammed shut across the street. Boots hit the gravel. One man walked toward the two of them, slow, unhurried, a big blue dog trailing behind him. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He just kept coming. The drunk man turned. His name was Cole Braddock, and he had no idea that the woman in the mud would cost him everything he'd worked for. What was she doing out there alone? Stay with me on this one. Now the man standing over her was twice Cole's width. Thick through the neck, big hands, the kind of drunk that thinks it's bulletproof. He saw Cole coming and squared up, told him to keep walking, said this was none of his business. Cole didn't answer. He just looked down at the woman in the mud, at the way she was trying to push herself up and couldn't, and something in his jaw set hard. The big man swung first. That was his mistake. Cole ducked under it, drove a fist into the soft part just below the ribs, and the big man folded like a bad tent. One hit. That was all it took. The man went down into the puddle and stayed there, wheezing, and Cole stepped over him like he was a fallen branch. He knelt beside the woman. She was young, maybe 22, 23. Dark hair plastered to her face, a nice coat ruined with mud, one shoe gone. She smelled like a whole barrel of cheap whiskey. She looked up at him with eyes that couldn't quite find him and said something that wasn't words. Cole sighed. He looked back at the saloon, at the silver spur sign swinging in the wind, and there was nobody in that doorway coming to claim her. Whoever brought her here had left her here. That was the part that got him. A man could take a woman out drinking. Fine. But you don't leave her in the mud behind a saloon in the rain. You just don't. Where Cole came from, that was the one thing you never did. The dog nosed at her hand. Old blue heeler, gray around the muzzle, name of Biscuit. Cole had raised him from a pup. Biscuit gave her a sniff, licked her cheek once, and looked up at Cole like he was asking a question. Cole nodded. Yeah, all right. He got an arm under her shoulders and the other under her knees and lifted her up. She wasn't heavy. She mumbled into his collar, something about being sorry, something about her father. Cole carried her to the truck and set her on the bench seat. Biscuit hopped up between them, and the woman slumped against the door, out cold before Cole even turned the key. He sat there a second, hands on the wheel, rain drumming on the roof. He should have driven her to the sheriff. That was the sensible thing. But the sheriff in this town was a mean old cuss who'd toss her in a cell and let the whole valley talk about it by Sunday. And a woman like that, a woman who said sorry when she was hurt, didn't deserve to wake up in a cell. So Cole did the only other thing he could think of. He drove her home. Home for Cole was a one-room bunkhouse out past the old Delaney place, a shack he rented cheap while he saved up. He carried her in, laid her on his cot, pulled his one-wool blanket over her, and set a bucket by the bed in case she needed it. Then he built up the stove, sat down in the one chair he owned, and watched over her. Didn't touch her, didn't ask her name, just sat there with Biscuit's head on his boot and made sure she kept breathing. The night went long. A couple of times she stirred and muttered, and Cole leaned forward ready, but she only turned her face to the wall and went quiet again. Once she said the word Papa, clear as anything, and there was something scared in it that put a knot in Cole's chest. He didn't know this woman, but he knew that sound. He'd made it himself once, a long time back as a boy in a house that wasn't kind. So he stayed in that chair. He watched the stove burn down and built it up again. And when the rain finally eased off toward morning, he was still sitting there, tired to the bone, guarding a stranger for no reason he could have put into words. Here's the thing about Cole Braddock you need to understand. He had nothing. 31 years old, and everything he owned fit in the back of that truck. He'd spent his whole life working other men's cattle, breaking other men's horses, sleeping in other men's bunkhouses, and he had exactly $41 to his name. No family that claimed him. No land, no cattle brand, no woman waiting anywhere. Just a good dog, a strong back, and a name nobody in that valley had heard of yet. But on Monday morning, that was all going to change. He'd been hired on at the Hollister Spread, the biggest ranch in the whole valley, 4,000 acres of the best grass in Montana. Steady work, real wages, a chance to finally build towards something of his own. He'd shaken on it with the foreman 2 weeks back. All he had to do was show up Monday, hat in hand, and not make a fool of himself. That job was the closest thing to a future Cole had ever held. And he'd have crawled over broken glass to keep it. He didn't sleep much that night. Toward dawn the woman stirred, sat up, looked around the strange room with wide, frightened eyes. Cole raised both hands slow and told her she was safe. Told her he'd found her behind the spur and brought her somewhere warm and nothing else had happened and she could go whenever she liked. She stared at him a long moment. Her eyes went from him to the door to the folded blanket and back again, working it out. Then she nodded, slow, laid back down and slept again. When Cole finally dozed off in that chair, she was breathing easy. When he woke, she was gone. The cot was made up neat, the blanket folded square. The bucket was rinsed and set by the door. And on the little table by the stove sat a folded piece of paper with 3 words written on it in a careful hand. "Thank you, truly." That was all. No name, no address, just that. Cole stood there in the gray morning light holding that note, and he could still smell the whiskey in the room, faint now, mixed with the wood smoke. He didn't know who she was. He figured he never would. Some stranger passing through, some rancher's wife who'd had a bad night, gone now and best forgotten. He tucked the note in his shirt pocket without quite knowing why. Then he fed Biscuit, boiled his coffee, and got ready for the week ahead. Monday was coming, and Monday was going to be the start of everything. Monday came clear and cold, the storm blown out, the mountains sharp and white against a hard blue sky. Cole put on his one good shirt. He shaved with cold water and a dull razor. He brushed his hat and knocked the dried mud off his boots and drove out to the Hollister Spread with Biscuit riding shotgun, because a man doesn't leave his dog behind on the biggest morning of his life. The whole way out he ran it through his head. Show up. Say yes, sir. Work hard. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes open. He'd been on a dozen ranches and he knew the way of it. You proved yourself in the first week or you didn't last the month. Cole meant to last. The Hollister place took his breath a little, even having seen it before. A great white house up on the rise, barns bigger than churches, corrals full of good horses, cattle scattered across the hills like somebody spilled them. This was real money, old money. The kind Cole had only ever worked the edges of. He parked by the corral, told Biscuit to stay, and walked up toward the main house where a group of men stood waiting by the porch steps. The foreman was there. So were 4 or 5 hands, and up on the porch above them all stood the owner himself. Amos Hollister was 70 years old and built like a fence post that had never once thought about bending. White hair, hard mouth, eyes like 2 chips of river ice. He owned half the valley and acted like he owned the other half too. Men said he'd run 3 sons off the place and buried a wife nobody talked about. He stood on that porch in a black coat with his thumbs in his belt and looked down at the hands gathered below like a judge sizing up the guilty. Cole took his hat off and held it against his chest, the way you do. He'd meet the man's eye, say yes sir, and get to work. Simple. Then a door opened behind Amos Hollister, and a young woman stepped out onto the porch to stand beside her father. Cole's whole body went cold. It was her, the woman from the mud. Cleaned up now, hair pinned, wearing a proper dress, standing straight and sober on the porch of the biggest house in the valley. But it was her. There was no mistaking that face. And when her eyes landed on Cole standing down there in the yard with his hat in his hands, the color drained right out of her. She knew him too. In half a second, both of them understood exactly what they were looking at. Cole had carried the boss's daughter home drunk. He'd laid her in his bed. He'd been alone with her all night in a one-room shack. And now here they both were, in front of her iron-fisted father and every hand on the place. Cole's mind went white and fast. One wrong word from either of them, and it was all over for both of them, right here in this yard. Amos Hollister's voice cut across the yard. "This is my daughter, Margaret," he said flat, to no one in particular. "You'll treat her with respect or you'll answer to me." His cold eyes swept the men and landed on Cole. "You, the new one, Braddock, you got a problem." Cole's mouth had gone dry as sand. Margaret's eyes were locked on his, wide, pleading, one tiny shake of her head so small nobody else could have caught it. "Please, don't." And Cole understood. If he said one word about that night, if it so much as showed on his face, Amos Hollister would ruin them both. She'd be branded the town drunk's daughter, the girl who spent a night in a hired man's bed. And Cole would be gone before noon, run off the place, run out of the valley, back to nothing. So Cole did the only thing he could. He looked Amos Hollister dead in the eye, easy as you please, and said, "No, sir. No problem at all, pleased to be here." And that was it. Amos grunted. The foreman started barking out the day's work. The moment passed. Cole put his hat back on with a hand that wasn't quite steady and walked off toward the horse barn with the other men, and behind him he could feel Margaret Hollister watching him go. He'd done it. He'd kept the secret. He'd saved them both. As he threw a saddle over a big roan gelding and swung up, Cole let himself breathe. Nobody knew. Nobody had to know. He'd keep his head down, do his work, stay clear of the boss's daughter, and in 6 months this'd be a story he never told anybody. The danger had passed. It was going to be all right. That's what he thought. Standing there in the sun with the work laid out ahead of him, Cole Braddock actually let himself believe the hard part was over. It was just getting started. The trigger came at noon, and it came in the shape of a fat sheriff's car rolling up the Hollister Drive in a cloud of dust. 2 men got out. One was the sheriff. The other was the big drunk from behind the saloon, the one Cole had put in the mud, and he was pointing a thick finger straight across the yard at Cole and hollering that there he was, that's the man, that's the one who jumped him. And just like that, everything changed. This wasn't a secret between 2 people anymore. This was the law. See, the big man Cole had dropped wasn't just some drunk. He was Del Rankin, and Rankin's brother owned the feed store and half the notes on the small ranches in the valley, and the Rankins and the Hollisters went back 40 years, thick as thieves. Del Rankin had gone to the sheriff claiming a stranger had beaten and robbed him behind the Silver Spur on Saturday night. Robbed. That was the word that turned it. A fistfight was one thing, but robbery was prison. And the only person on this earth who could clear Cole's name was the woman he'd sworn to protect, because the only reason Cole had thrown that punch was to get Del Rankin off of her. The sheriff walked up to Cole where he stood by the barn, asked him where he was Saturday night. Cole said he was home. Alone. Cole hesitated. And that hesitation, that half-second flicker, told the sheriff everything he needed to know. He got a look in his eye, the look of a man who's just watched a fish take the hook. Amos Hollister came down off the porch, drawn by the noise, demanding to know what was happening on his land. Del Rankin was shouting about being robbed of $40 and a good watch by this drifter Hollister had hired. And the whole thing was tipping, right there, from bad to disaster, because Cole could not tell the truth without destroying Margaret, and he could not stay silent without going to prison. He stood there with the barn at his back and no way out of it that didn't cost somebody everything. Before I tell you what he chose, do me one favor. If you've made it this far and you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. It's the one thing that tells me these stories matter to you and it costs you nothing. All right, back to it. Cole stood there with the sheriff on one side and Amos Hollister on the other and Del Rankin's finger in his face, and he made his choice. He'd take it. Whatever came, he'd take it and keep her name out of it. He looked the sheriff in the eye and said he'd had words with a man behind the spur, yes, but he never robbed anybody, and he'd swear that on anything the sheriff wanted. The sheriff said words don't clear a man, said he'd need to take Cole in, sort it out proper. And Amos Hollister, who'd hired Cole 2 weeks back on the foreman's word, looked at this hired hand about to be hauled off his land for robbery and started to turn away in disgust. A man was only as good as his name, and Cole's name was Mud. Then a voice cut across the yard, clear and cold and steady. "That's a lie." Every head turned. Margaret Hollister was coming down the porch steps, chin up, back straight, walking right into the middle of all those men. Her father told her to go back inside. This was no place for her. She ignored him. She walked straight up to the sheriff and said it again, louder. "Del Rankin's a liar. Cole Braddock never robbed a soul." The sheriff asked how she'd know that. And Margaret Hollister, standing in front of her father and every hand on the ranch, lifted her chin and told the truth. "Because I was there," she said. "Del Rankin had me by the hair in the mud behind the silver spur. He was kicking me. He was reaching for my purse. And this man," she turned and pointed at Cole, "this man came across the street and knocked him off of me and carried me somewhere safe when nobody else in this whole town would lift a finger. He's not a thief. He's the only reason I'm standing here." You could have heard a pin drop in that yard. The foreman took his hat off slow. One of the hands looked at his boots, and Del Rankin's face, which had been so sure and so loud a minute before, started to come apart at the edges. Amos Hollister's face had gone white as bone. He stared at his daughter like he'd never seen her before. "You were where?" he said low. "You were in the mud behind a saloon, drunk." His voice was climbing now. "You spent Saturday night where, Margaret? Where?" And this was the moment Cole had feared most, the moment he'd been ready to go to prison to prevent, because now it was all coming out, all of it, in front of everybody. Margaret didn't flinch. "I spent it sleeping it off in his bunkhouse," she said. "On his cot, while he sat up in a chair all night to make sure no harm came to me. He didn't touch me. He didn't ask my name. He didn't even know who I was. And in the morning I left before he woke because I was ashamed, and I never even thanked him properly." Her voice cracked, just a little, right at the end. "So you can call me whatever you want, Papa, but you're not letting this man take the blame for saving my life." The sheriff looked at Del Rankin. Del Rankin had gone quiet, because now there was a witness, and the witness was Amos Hollister's own daughter, and no sheriff in that valley was going to arrest a man on Del Rankin's word against the word of a Hollister. But there was more to it than that. Del Rankin had put his hands on Margaret Hollister. He'd kicked her in the ribs behind a saloon. And that fact was now hanging in the air of Amos Hollister's own front yard, in front of Amos Hollister's own eyes. The sheriff, who was no fool, suddenly wanted to be anywhere else. He mumbled something about a misunderstanding and looking into it further and started backing toward his car. But Amos Hollister wasn't looking at the sheriff anymore. He was looking at Del Rankin. And I want you to understand something about the old man. He was hard and he was cold, and he'd run his own sons off the place. But he had exactly one thing left in this world that he loved, and she was standing right there, and this man had put his boot into her ribs and left her in the mud. Amos Hollister crossed that yard slow. Del Rankin, who was twice Cole's size and 3 times the old man's, actually took a step back. Amos got right up in his face, close enough to whisper, and whatever the old man said, nobody else heard it. But Del Rankin got in his car and left and never once set foot on Hollister land again. And within the year the Rankins had sold out and moved south, and folks in that valley never did learn exactly why. That's the kind of man Amos Hollister was, once you got to the thing he cared about. Then the old man turned around, and now he was facing Cole. And this was the part Cole had been dreading since the moment Margaret stepped onto that porch, because the truth was out now, all of it, and here came the reckoning. A hired hand who'd had the boss's daughter in his bed all night. Cole stood his ground. He'd stopped running from things a long time ago. If the old man wanted to run him off, he'd go, but he'd look him in the eye first. Amos Hollister walked up to Cole, those ice-chip eyes going over him head to foot. The whole yard held its breath, and the old man said, "Quiet, you knocked Del Rankin down with one punch." It wasn't a question. Cole said, "Yes, sir." Amos studied him a moment longer. "And you sat up all night in a chair rather than lay a hand on a drunk girl who didn't know her own name?" Cole said, "Yes, sir." Wouldn't have been right. The old man's jaw worked. Something moved behind those cold eyes, something Cole couldn't read. "You could have told the sheriff the truth this morning," Amos said. "Cleared yourself in one breath. Sent my girl's name through the mud to save your own neck. Why didn't you?" Cole was quiet a moment. Then he said the truest thing he knew. "Because she asked me not to. And a man who'd break that to save himself isn't a man worth the ground he stands on." For a long moment Amos Hollister didn't say anything at all. The wind came down off the mountains and moved through the yard. Biscuit, waiting in the truck this whole time, gave one low whine. And then the old man did something no hand on that place had ever seen him do. He put out his hand. Cole looked at it. Then he took it, and the old man's grip was iron, and Amos Hollister said, loud enough for every man there to hear, "You've got a job on this ranch as long as I'm breathing, Braddock. And any man who says a word against my daughter's name or yours answers to me." He let go, turned, and walked back toward the house. At the bottom of the steps he stopped. Without turning around he said, "Supper's at 6. You'll eat at the house tonight. Bring the dog." And he went inside. Cole stood there in the yard, not quite believing what had just happened. Around him the hands started drifting back to work, a couple of them clapping him on the shoulder as they passed. And Margaret Hollister was still standing there, looking at him, and for the first time since that porch door had opened, she smiled. It changed her whole face. Cole felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long, long time, maybe ever, and he didn't have a name for it yet, but he knew he was in trouble of an entirely different kind now. Supper at 6 was a stiff, strange thing at first. Amos Hollister at the head of a long table, Margaret across from Cole, Biscuit lying in the corner with a plate of scraps the cook had grumbled about. Nobody quite knew what to say. But somewhere around the second, helping the old man asked Cole where he learned to break horses, and Cole told him, and one story led to another, and by the time the pie came out, Amos Hollister was actually laughing at something Cole said, a rusty sound like a gate that hadn't swung in years. Margaret caught Cole's eye across the table more than once. Every time she looked away smiling. It didn't happen fast after that. That's not how these things go, and it's not how they went. Cole did his work and did it well, and he was careful, always careful, to give Margaret her distance and her respect. He wasn't going to be the hand who took liberties with the boss's daughter because the boss had shaken his hand once. But you can't stop two people from finding reasons to cross paths. She started bringing coffee out to the corral in the mornings. He started fixing things around the house that didn't strictly need fixing. They'd talk over the fence for a few minutes that stretched into an hour. She told him about the mother she'd lost, and the brothers who'd left, and how big and empty that white house got with just her and her father rattling around in it. He told her things he'd never told anybody, and slow, the way good things grow, something real took root between them. Amos Hollister saw it. Of course he saw it. Nothing happened on that ranch he didn't see. But he didn't run Cole off, and he didn't say a word against it, and that was as close to a blessing as the old man had in him. One evening on the porch he told Cole, in that flat, hard way of his, that his daughter had made exactly one good decision the night she got drunk behind the Silver Spur, and that was the sorry man who'd carried her home. That was all he ever said about it. It was enough. They were married the following autumn, under the cottonwoods down by the creek, with the mountains gold behind them and half the valley there to watch. Margaret wore her mother's dress. Amos Hollister walked her out and put her hand in Cole's and didn't let anybody see him wipe his eyes, though everybody did. Biscuit sat at Cole's feet through the whole thing, gray in the muzzle and slow in the hips now, but there. That old dog had been the first one to say she was all right, that rainy night in the mud. It seemed only fair he got to see how it all came out. Cole never did get his own little spread. He got something bigger. When Amos Hollister passed, 4 years on, he left the whole 4,000 acres to his daughter and the hired man who'd sat up all night in a chair rather than do her wrong. The men in the valley who'd once watched a sheriff try to haul Cole off for robbery now took their wages from his hand and called him boss and never thought twice about it. And on rainy nights, when the storms came down off the mountains and hammered the roof of that big white house, Cole would sometimes think back to a woman in the mud behind a saloon, and a note with 3 words on it, and how close the whole thing had come to going the other way. He kept that note. Thank you, truly. He kept it in a drawer by the bed for the rest of his life, and every so often he'd take it out and read it, and Margaret would catch him at it and shake her head and smile. Because here's the thing about one act of kindness on a bad night. You never know what it's going to cost you, and you never know what it's going to buy. Cole Braddock reached down into the mud for a stranger with nothing to gain and everything to lose, and it cost him a night's sleep and damn near cost him his freedom. But what it bought him was a life, a home, a family, everything he'd ever wanted and never once believed he'd have. Sometimes the smallest thing a man does, the thing nobody's watching, the thing he does just because it's right, turns out to be the thing that saves him. Cole learned that behind a saloon in the rain, with a beat-up stranger in his arms and an old blue dog looking up at him, asking a question. And the answer, it turned out, was yes. All right. Yeah, that was the whole of it. Rewrite complete. Word count is now 4,987 words, inside the 4,805,200 target. What I kept untouched, the 150-word opening hook verbatim. The entire ending from that was the whole of it back through the note and the closing reflection, the 6-chapter structure, the false calm. It was going to be all right. The noon trigger, the CTA placement after the first payoff, and single-dot punctuation throughout. Where I added the tilde 560 words, all in the middle, deepening existing beats rather than inventing new ones. Setup, a fuller night watch passage, the papa cry, Cole's own boyhood echo, and more concrete texture on how alone and empty-handed Cole was. Inciting incident, more of the drive out and Cole's inner rehearsal, plus a beat extending the frozen recognition on the porch. Escalation, sharpened the sheriff's fish took the hook, Reed and Cole's no way out corner. Payoff, small reaction beats in the yard, foreman's hat, Del Rankin coming apart, to let the confession land harder. None of these change plot, order, or stakes progression. Each addition sits inside a beat that was already escalating.